Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and this is my monthly delight, talking with Karen De La Carriere. Hi, Karen.
Jon, my sweetheart. Big hug to you.
Big hug to you too. Yeah. So we're going to talk about something that isn't marvelous. The purpose of Scientology, we're told, is a world without war, insanity, or crime. Scientology, as yet, hasn't launched any wars, save against people like you and me, I suppose. But it has caused insanity, and we are today going to talk about Scientology from the perspective of a sort of mafia gang. Yeah, the criminality of Scientology. And let me tell a story about the first crime. Did somebody ask me, he was writing a paper for a conference, and he was an independent Scientologist, and he wrote to me and he said, when was the first criminal activity on the part of Scientology? And I said, oh, it was 1952, the first I've found. A man called James Elliott stole the mailing lists of the Wichita Dianetic Foundation on behalf of Ron Hubbard. I've got, I think, 31 letters that Hubbard sent to the whole of that mailing list, not his mailing list. And Elliott was caught carrying the stuff out, but still managed somehow to get it to Hubbard. And on the letterhead, it says, Ron Hubbard, business manager, James Elliott. So he named him. And this guy came back to me and said, no, I didn't mean that. When did it start after David Mayo left? It's like, are we going to forget the 30 years leading up to it? And we don't mind about that because David Mayo is, we independents, it's the harassment happened against us. And it's just not true. It was criminal from the very beginning, in as much as there were 5 foundations created. Most people don't realize that 2 of them were run by psychologists because the psychs are awful people, but they were. Hubbard managed to bankrupt all 5 of them by putting money into his own pocket, and he got away with it. In fact, he got away with a tremendous amount. So anyway, that's the beginning of the incident, the first incident on the chain that we've been able to find. And let's move forward instead of backward from that incident. And
Jon, the cult of Scientology has been on a 50-year crime wave. Crime after crime after crime. And to deflect from their own criminal, you see, they redefined crime. Anything you do to preserve and flow power is the expression to the cult's existence, to support the cult, anything you do is a good deed.
Yes.
Any horrendous thing you do.
Yeah.
Horrendous. To take out a critic or someone exposing Scientology, anything you do is laudable and commendable. So good and evil have been completely redefined. Good is anything you do to make Scientology survive. Bad is anything you do to lessen the strength of the cult.
Yeah.
Hubbard designed it that way.
Yes, absolutely. And the greatest good, I mean, it took me a long time to work this out. If the only person who can actually discover technology that liberates people is Ron Hubbard, then Ron Hubbard's all that matters.
Yes.
And he certainly took that point of view with the hideous and horrific things that he did to other people. I was shocked last week. I was watching an interview with some people in Ukraine, and they'd taken some men and tortured them. The Russian army had taken some men and tortured them and asked them, about their Nazi views and where were the Nazis and all of this. And you sort of go, this was so reminiscent of, when I talked with Mike Grinder, and he said that the only time we'd met during his time in Scientology, he came on a mission to silence me. And he said, in very matter of fact, he said, you seem like a nice chap, but I would have destroyed you if I'd had the chance, because you were opposed to Scientology, and opposed to Scientology equals antisocial personality, an enemy of all that lives. And that kind of fervor, that kind of fanaticism is a deadly weapon, where people start believing that a country that's led by a Jewish president is a Nazi country. We just get into through the looking glass. We're the other side of the looking glass. Scientology is the opposite of what it pretends to be, and it always was. And the criminal accuses others of things he himself is. I used to keep a picture of Ron Hubbard cut out from a Scientology magazine that had that written underneath it, just to remind myself, that Ron Hubbard was accusing all of us of things he himself had done for the most part.
Because Scientology is designed this way, people go on a crusade. It becomes radicalized. They're like in a jihad to take out. Let me tell you what. Let me give you a couple of anecdotes here.
Surely.
I came out very loudly on Marty Rathman's blog. Marty announced me, and there was this. I got 500 email in one evening, and Scientology rolled up their sleeves to get me. Oh, this was what they saw worthy of retaliation in a heavy duty manner. So what they did is they got my son, who died at their toxic policy of disconnection. They got my son to call me up and say, "Oh, mom, there's an interesting website I want you to look at." And Osa was in the background. You could hear them.
Office of Special Affairs.
Office of Special Affairs.
Very special affairs.
This branch of Scientology C organization, deal with legal, intelligence, and PR. No. The intelligence is means dirty tricks, take out your enemies, espionage. It's intelligence. It's their intelligence branch. So they get my son to take me to a hate website on me. My son. And he said, "Mom, I didn't know you had a boob job." They mocked. They took it out of my confessional folders. Who cares about someone's private? This was for me and my boyfriend at the time. No. I had a boob job. They got my son to mock me and show me a hate website. This was first one. But you know what, John? It takes a lot to scare me. I thought to myself, I slaved for you for those years, almost 20 years. I worked morning, noon, and night. I wanted to believe in it all. I packed up my existence in London and moved to St. Hill for 2 years to live with Aunt Greg, number 6 St. Hill Green, because I believed and I thought this was some good entity. Yeah. And the next thing they do is they make an anonymous call to the FBI claiming I'm a child trafficker. In underage sex, in children, for underage sex. And who they name is my former CPA called Bill Green. Anyway, the FBI, if it's to do
that's your accountant for
accountant.
Certified public accountant.
Certified public accountant, CPA. And I'm glad you clarified the words, John. So the FBI show up at Bill Green's home, and Bill Green truly has a corporate nerdy look. This is a guy who graduated from Harvard with all he's totally into Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. He's not. So they're looking at him, and he doesn't look like he would be a child trafficker from Karen. It didn't sound. So after a couple, the FBI and a special agent for children trafficking sitting beside him, they lean back and they say, Mr. Green, the allegation is Karen De La Carriere shipping you young children. They said, does Karen De La Carriere have any enemies? This is the FBI question.
Mm.
And Bill Green said, well, she came right out of Scientology 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And the FBI, their body language, the way the interview was over, they know the dirty tricks. They know what Scientology has done for decades.
It's the first item in the playbook that you're accused of sexual crimes against children. My wife, my first wife, opened the door one day. We had 2 small children at the time. They're a lot bigger now. And there was some police officer and somebody from social services come to take my then 4-year-old daughter away. And as soon as Scientology were mentioned, it was like, oh, I'm really sorry about that. Paulette Cooper was accused of molesting children. It's just, what will make somebody unpopular? What will set people against them? We will do that. And I think it's really of itself a criminal offense that they're, it's criminal libel. It's not just regular everyday nastiness. This is deliberate, determined. Let me tell you a little story. I can tell you this story. As you know, I gave a talk at Eton College, and it took Scientology 2 months to actually get to Eton, and with a rebuttal. I've still not seen this rebuttal, but I'm pretty sure what's in it. And the idea that they want to stop you from talking about them. Communication is the universal solvent, Ron Hubbard said, unless, of course, it's got the truth about Scientology or him involved in it. The wonderful story of a squirrel part 2, and I've lost my copy, and if anybody out there has a copy of Story of a Squirrel part 2, which came out in about 1983, and it was some wag who obviously understood Scientology very deeply, and it purports to come from the senior case supervisor international, who is just declaring himself suppressive, right? And he calls himself Ray Mitberg. And in it, he says, people confuse ethics and tech. Let me make this clear. Tech is to make money, boxcar loads of it. Ethics is to deal with anyone that finds out about this or me, Ron Hubbard. And as definitions go, that is pretty good. The tech is to make money, boxcar loads of it. And ethics is to deal with anybody that finds out that's what's actually going on. And Hubbard died with, I think there were 300 outstanding writs against him. And David Miscavige's job was to clear those writs. And I'm afraid that's a flunk for David Miscavige, that in the end, he perished with still unable to go out in public because he was a wanted criminal. He's named as a co-conspirator in the case where Mary Sue Hubbard was sent to prison. There were 38 unindicted co-conspirators, including Ron Hubbard. So he was a known criminal. And of course, the way that they identified his body in San Luis Obispo was because the Sheriff's Department already had his fingerprints from, I think, 1948, when he'd passed a bad check.
And was arrested.
Yeah, so just like Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, he had a criminal record for fraud before he set up his religion.
But John, I got to tell you, Hubbard is dead and gone. We can talk.
Let's hope.
Hubbard is dead and gone. The thing is, there's present time criminality, and my videos like to focus on people that can be arrested right now and indicted right now. I'm really focused on present time criminality by perpetrators that are right out there that are doing evil now. Now, are they doing it in the vein of Hubbard? Yes. But we can talk about Hubbard till the cows come home. There's no arrest ever going to be done. There's just disclosures, and the internet is just glutted with Hubbard's malfeasance and crimes. What I want to do is focus on the continued criminality, which is indictable and arrestable now in present time.
Yep.
And Valeska Paris did, I'll have Spike put up a nice link to this. Tony, a couple of days ago, did an incredible detailed write-up.
This is Tony Ortega,
Tony Ortega.
The Underground
His
Bunker.
blog is called The Underground Bunker. I dearly, dearly want your audience to read this. The criminality of this group is actually, it's beyond belief. It's beyond belief. While they pretend to handle your trauma and your pain and your unconsciousness, they made this girl, still a teenager, go down to the bowels of Freewinds and scrub the engine room walls till she went unconscious more than once. The engine room punishment on Freewinds was notorious. I know a South African girl they did this to.
I should imagine the engine room is pretty hot. Is that
very
right?
hot, very stifling. And it has the residual odors of the engine oils. And so you're not breathing fresh oxygen. And Valeska has no idea how long she had passed out. Could have been a day, could have been hours, who knows. But this is a group that hide their punishments away from the FBI's ability. Ship is mostly American citizens. They have some.
And it's out of the Netherlands Antilles, isn't it? So it's a Dutch.
Yeah.
So the Dutch should be doing something about it, one presumes.
Yeah. Oh, the Dutch have had a lot of reports on. But anyway, also the Freewinds, to hide, because it's a criminal ship with criminal activity morning, noon, and night. They are registered in Panama, but it's managed by some I don't know if it's in Curacao, and it's a hall of mirrors as to who really. We know that David Miscavige and the Church of Scientology International absolutely have ownership, but you'd never find that in the corporate papers. It's all, Jeffrey has a whole, on Scientology Money Project, he explains the labyrinth and the cunning to one, avoid taxes, two, to avoid, you don't even know what government in the world, but we know it's a Scientology ship. Come on.
Yeah, and I mean, this is news that I broke in the 1980s in court cases back then. Back in '88, I went through the corporate structure of Scientology, and I found that there were people who had come out who said, well, we were directors of some of these hundreds, literally hundreds of corporations, but David Miscavige kept undated signed resignations. And that's the point where you have a corporate monolith, and and you've pierced the corporate veil, as they say in legal terms, that there is no Church of Scientology. That doesn't exist, and it never did. The only Church of Scientology that was ever registered was in Camden, New Jersey in December '53 by Ron Hubbard, and it was never activated. He himself would lie and say it was Burton Farber in February '54 who founded the Church of Scientology of California. I was shocked when I left to find out I'd belonged to an imaginary organization. There's no Church of Scientology. And what's more, there's no Religious Technology Center, no Church of Spiritual Technology. All of these things are David Miscavige.
Yes.
That's the whole corporation. The rest are just names, so that they can evade tax and they can evade legal prosecution, which they've managed to do fairly successfully. given the amount of cases that they've pushed away. But nonetheless, you're dealing with an organization that will seek to destroy its opponents, but is also consuming its own members like some vicious monster.
Yeah.
And we're talking about children who've been imprisoned and enslaved and forced into child labor.
Yeah.
And we're talking about governments that are not doing anything about this because they don't want to fight with Scientology, because they have the delusion that Scientology is huge and powerful. Scientology has about 25,000 members now. It's down to almost nothing. Governments are just cowards and scaredy cats. They ought to get their ethics in and do something, particularly about child labor and human trafficking, which have been going on for decades in Scientology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Valeska actually names David Miscavige, and apparently, and she has a big shot law firm. She and Gawain, another Australian youngster who went through the same, and Gawain's wife Laurie, all three of them have filed this lawsuit with the big law firm. And the fact that the law firm even took, now it seems a little bit far back, but I'll tell you, John, they've already won. Whether they win in the law courts or not, this made the Daily Mail, which has just a huge audience. The Daily Mail itemized their crimes in big block letters, line after line after line. It made, because she's sort of married an Australian, Valeska, and lives in Brisbane. The Sydney Morning Herald did a thing on it. Tampa Bay Times, because a lot of the criminality went on in Clearwater. So just to read it is if anyone suffered SEAL, you would get a visceral feeling just reading the details of how low they will go. So you see, Scientology has do you agree with me, John? Scientology has a self-sabotage. In a way, it's a saboteur of itself because of its criminal conduct. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing, as somebody who dug out so much of the material that is now, is now known and made available. So, for example, we talked about their intelligence division, OSA investigation. I published the 800-page pack in 1994, I think it was. Put it onto the internet where you can still find it. 800 pages about how to harass people. I am sick and tired of people who come to me and they've not read my work. They don't know what they're talking about, and they've not looked at the Hubbard references. So anybody that thinks that Hubbard didn't know what was going on needs to read the LRH conference with the investigators, which is part of the investigation full hat. I was very shocked to find, because the copy I had and a friend of mine reconstructed it, I didn't do that work. An incredible piece of work. He got the check sheet from the case against Mary Sue Hubbard, and he found everything on it, all 800 pages, and put it together. And I was truly shocked because it was reissued after we'd got rid of the Guardian's office, after we'd got rid of all of the criminals, the crims from the Guardian's office in the early 1980s. This pack was reissued in 1991. And the only change is the title page. It no longer says Guardian's Office Investigation Full Hat. It says Office of Special Affairs. Every other word is the same. That includes material on breaking and entering, how to lie, all of the trickery and nastiness. And you get this justification, the idea, well, I sat with a guy many years ago and who was still a member, and I said to him, all of this fair game, all of this harassing people. He said, well, we've got very little time to save the world. So it's like, and here we are, it's like 35 years after that conversation, and they still haven't saved the world. Thankfully, we've saved the world from them. because it would not be a good place if they were in charge. You know,
Hubbard made a chilling statement on a Class 8 tape. He said, "We are not just going to teach the planet, we are going to own the planet, and the planet will obey us." He meant the planet will obey me.
Yeah, and at that time, which is around about...
This is a political statement.
Yeah, around about 1968, when he is putting forward the Class 8 course and operating Thetan Level 3 with all its madness, there is an internal order where he says we are going to make friends with the biggest enemies of the West. It's called zones of action. And, you know, I'd left Scientology when I started seeing this material and realizing that at the top level, he was trying to found his own country. You know, there are various attempts at that. You know, I was talking with somebody the other day about Rhodesia, and Hubbard said, you know, that he'd been thrown out of Rhodesia in 66 because, and he'd found out that an operating Thetan couldn't act on his own, couldn't be on his own. What most people don't know is that he wasn't on his own. There was a man called Morley Glazier with Hubbard in Rhodesia. Morley Glazier wasn't thrown out of Rhodesia until he'd served a prison sentence for stealing the government material that Hubbard had sent him in to get. So, you know, it's just this tangle of criminal threads that lead us to a present day situation where scaredy cat governments, an FBI that really doesn't care about the people, are not doing anything to round up this massive mafia gang that is operating all over the world. And that is, the worst part of it is that all of the people that are doing this, or nearly all of the people that are doing this work, believe that they're doing good. They believe that they are transforming the world. And you know, and they talk about being the most ethical people in the world, which is certainly not my experience of Scientology after leaving, and 16 solid years of harassment.
There's part when the US government were totally seemed to be unable to handle the mafia, the mob.
Well, because the FBI made deals with them in the late 1930s and early 40s, but, you know,
right.
They were in bed together.
They grew and they were billions a year, this and that.
Yeah.
Rudy Giuliani and a team of others decided to just tweak the law. And the law was called RICO.
Racketeering Influenced Corrupt Organizations. Was that really Giuliani? I thought that was before
Giuliani. Very much so. You Google it.
Because Scientology, we were putting a case together in '87 against Scientology under RICO, which we didn't manage to put through. Not a big fan of Rudy Giuliani, forgive me.
Oh, I have no opinion on Giuliani. I'm just saying why I even brought this up is tweaking the law. RICO now made it easier for prosecution, because if you collude, if you're plotting and planning as a group, so arresting just one mob member didn't really, there was gazillion, but you could, this business of a group, I want the world to know that in Office of Special Affairs Intelligence, they are co-conspirators sitting there in the 10th floor of the Hollywood Guarantee Building, 6331 Hollywood Boulevard, where they sit there plotting the destruction and horrible actions on their real or perceived enemies. This isn't just some happen. They don't just come out and do some. This is plotted and programmed. Have you ever seen the program they did on Chuck Beatty? They itemized step by step, and then they designated to a particular hat, like invest section operator, whatever. They plotted to have his computer have pornographic images, and then but they would perpetrate that.
Oh yeah.
And then inform law enforcement, look, he's got child porn on his computer, this kind of thing. They did the same thing with Tory Christman.
Yeah, my guru.
And it's programmed. These people sit around who sign million-year contracts for religious, ecclesiastical freedom of their eternity. And they sit around plotting destruction. Plotting destruction of people who often served, in my case, almost 20 years, served them. Look at the destruction they did on David May, but they do it over and over and over again. And it's a real loser. What they don't calculate is the side effects or collateral damage. Did they really believe that I would shrink in a ball and go away because they make hate pages? Did they really for a moment believe that I wouldn't come right back out?
If they hadn't harassed me, I would have walked away after a few weeks. It was when they harassed me, and more so when I realized that there was a harassment machine, and my situation was bizarre because I'd stopped believing in Scientology, but my friends still believed, and they needed help to defend themselves from Scientology. And that's how I became the historian of Scientology, largely because there was harassment and I had to understand the law. I had to understand what was going on because my friends were being harmed. And they were seeking to preserve Scientology. We began the independent movement in the UK. I was right there when it started. But I, after a few months, was sort of going, oh, I don't think this is not true. You know, it doesn't do what there are no clears, there are no operating thetans. It's a trap. But from there, I still felt that if my friends wanted to do this without the harassment, without the, you know, the fair game, the attacking other people, they should have the right to do it. And I continue to protect that right. But it was very definitely only less than 5% of people will actually be resilient against harassment. Most people will collapse. I've heard many people over the last 38 years since I left tell me, you know, oh, they can come after me and they'll see what happens. And within a couple of weeks, those people have evaporated. They've gone. So very few people, when the actual pain starts and you realize what's happening, most people given the chance will walk away. I'm not utterly sure why I didn't. And it was a very, very long, very hard time. But I still think I did the right thing, you know, and
absolutely,
you know, somebody has to stand up against it.
Some will walk away, but the loud ones, those that will stand their ground, they are huge. They become voices that compensate for any feeble-minded rah-rah. They will just...
And you discover that virtue is its own punishment, you know.
But John, I want to tell you that I'm an absolute ditto to you. I needed to vent a little. So in early days, I posted anonymously under the pen name War and Peace. And I said, I had to vent. I had 20 years of some incredibly cruel, torturous times. I had to vent. But I would have walked away. I've got a life. Jeez, I'm involved in many, many things outside the cult of Scientology. And I would have absolutely walked away.
Just to make it clear that we talk every month, and I have a small amount to do with this, but I do have a life. There are other things I do. This book came out. This is an Oxford University Press book. It came out 2 weeks ago, and it has a chapter in it that I co-wrote with Steve Hassan and two of his researchers. So I am doing other things. This is
Yeah.
Somebody wrote in the comments, how come after all these years he's still obsessed with Scientology? I spend no time on the subject of Scientology, except when we talk or if I talk with somebody else, because it's what I needed to do is done. I laid groundwork so the information is there.
Yeah.
Though frankly, it was already there in John Foster's government report in 1971. He had most of the good stuff in there. But to make sure that there can be resistance. And so when we look back at cases like Lisa McPherson or Kyle Brennan, the murder of Kyle Brennan in Clearwater, which was covered up by David Miscavige's sister personally. Lisa McPherson, of course, her death, her horrific death, that was, David Miscavige was directly involved with that. I talked with a journalist. She was at the St. Petersburg Times, I think, and a long time ago. And she said that she found, I think it was 8 other cases of suspicious deaths at Clearwater, Florida. And she happened to know the district attorney, and she'd known him for years. She was a woman, she'd won a Pulitzer, not for a Scientology story. Don't remember her name offhand. She was in her 70s, she was still working, and delightful woman. And she said that, so she talked with her old friend, the district attorney, and said, why aren't you prosecuting this? And his response was, I don't want anybody counting how many Scotch bottles there are in my trash. Lily-livered, fundamentally. And the Clearwater police, in the case of Kyle Brennan, talking to his mom, Victoria Britton, it's pretty evident that they just decided they didn't want to fight with Scientology. A young man was murdered. The police are meant to do something about that, protect and serve, So appalling, the power they have. And seeing that this criminality it'll go unchecked until somebody does something about it. And that somebody should be directed from a government. It shouldn't be people like you and me trying to stand up to this massive, vicious organization, but we do somehow.
The one thing that they do is make enemies with this obnoxious, hideous conduct. Scientology continues to make enemies in a screaming affluent state. There's barely a day that comes out when some new person surfaces who's left the cult and is willing to tell some of their dark secrets. John, this is really fun. I wanted to tell you that a person posted on, well, do you know a guy called Matt Pesh? Matt Pesh did 22 years in the Sea Org. He was Treasury Secretary of the FSO, but he was at Int Base for a long time, and he married Amy, who wrote the book Abuse at the Top. Okay. So Matt wrote that one day at Flag, he was looking in his friend's gym bag and found a gun. And he examined the gun and it was loaded. Now, Matt had done a few years in the RPF and he knew about pulling whittles.
So let's just stop there. The RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is the labor camp within Scientology, where you'll typically spend at least 2 years being a slave.
Sometimes 8 years, 10 years. So the prison camp is to reform your thought. You've fallen into
turn you into a zombie.
Yes, yeah. And they're going to whack you around. I did 6 months in that prison camp. Yeah. Now, he finds this loaded gun and he goes after this guy to confess. What is he doing with a loaded gun in the Sea Org in his gym bag? And the guy tells him and confesses that he was stealing things in local homes. He was stealing, robbing businesses. And of course, he was using this weapon. None of this was reported to Clearwater PD. None. So all these unsolved home burglaries, it was a Sea Org member with a loaded gun doing it.
Because
So
it's a crime in Scientology to bring Scientology into ill repute.
yes, yes, covered up for PR reasons. Anyway, the guy got kicked out of Scientology and so on. But it was a bombshell comment on Mike Rinder's blog that a CO member, oh, and you know, when he was questioned, why are you doing this? Why are you being a part-time CO member and a part-time armed robber with a loaded gun? And he said he was absolutely responsible that all the buildings had toilet paper and light bulbs and cleaning, and he could not get a penny out of them. So he resorted to stealing in order to fund toilet paper for the Sea Organization buildings. That was what he said. It sounds bizarre and strange, but then Matt outdid himself. This is really a good. Then he posted that the Finance office were reading transgression. You have to self-report your crimes weekly. It's called OW write-ups. OW
withhold write-ups.
Your overts and your withholds. And you have to self-report on yourself your crimes every week. There's a huge amount of theft going on of SEAL members stealing. They would steal from the canteen, basic things like toothpaste, underarm deodorant, basic necessities that you just need for your own hygiene.
Yeah.
And there was continuous theft, so that Finance had to step in and order that the CO members got paid, because they were getting no pay for their 70, 80-hour weeks of slave labor, zero money. Now, this is just ridiculous. If you look, Flag makes minimally in those days $1 million a week. Guess where all this money was going?
Oh, I know where it's going.
The CO members were being turned into little criminals. One person wrote that uniform parts were so hard to come by that when someone did laundry, they had to stay outside the laundry machine, because if they didn't, the parts of their laundry would get stolen.
Yeah.
Thievery was so rampant in the Sea Organization, the most ethical group. They tout themselves. They were just a bunch of petty thieves. Thieves, thievery, induced by Sea Org culture and forcing them to work with no pay. Although the $1 million made, gobs of it went to the hierarchy.
Well,
why?
Ron Hubbard died. When he died, he left $648 million.
Correct.
All of it taken from Scientology. He had no other income stream. His Mission Earth, his Battlefield Earth, they'd lost money because money was handed out to promote them and to make it look as if he'd become successful in the field of science fiction. So $648 million. I've talked with a number of people who smuggled money out of Swiss banks and over borders, broke the law. I know that he would have attaché cases full of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He'd have a stack of them in the mobile home where he ended his days, because he kept having his ranch remade because he was never happy with the style of it. So he lived in this trailer basically with these piles of money. So if he had to run away, and at the same time we hear that, for example, when he was making his technical films at La Quinta, none of which are available, which is kind of weird that Ron Hubbard spent so much time making these little films for Scientologists, and they've all disappeared. And the reason they've disappeared is because they're rubbish. But yeah, putting that aside, so he's running all of this. He's got movie cameras and, sets and all of this stuff. And the crew who are doing this are told that they're not producing enough And one of the punishments is exactly what you said, no toilet tissue. And so there were phone boxes for miles around that all had their yellow pages ripped out. And you sort of, what are we dealing with here? We're going to make a world without war, insanity, and crime, where this man is accumulating $648 million. I mean, in today's terms, certainly far more than $1 billion. All of it from the sweated
backs of the slaves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's despicable. And now we've got David Miscavige, who's sitting there with his Camel cigarette in one hand and his vape in the other, you know, his asthma vaporizer in the other. Same as Ron Hubbard, asthmatic smokers. I mean, why would we ever listen to such people? Why would we have a drug rehabilitation group set up by an alcoholic, L. Ron Hubbard, who admitted addiction to barbiturates in a lecture, who told people to take amphetamines, and then he's sort of talking to his poor messengers and saying, I wish I could give up smoking, you know, 100 cigarettes a day, you know, and he's an expert on drug rehabilitation. Not really.
You know, Hubbard said some really strange, wonky things that he said, not smoking will give you cancer.
It's fear of volcanoes that makes you smoke as well, apparently. I've never been frightened of a volcano in my life.
Yeah.
Health advice from L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
Not really a good idea. You sent over actually one of a quotation from L. Ron Hubbard, which is worth reading out in terms of, you know, I tend to think of religion as it should be something that's compassionate and helpful. I'm not really sure that it generally has been. I think the Aztecs ripping people's hearts out and the Thuggies strangling people, that's also an aspect of religion. But he said, 1, spot who is attacking us. 2, start investigating them promptly for felonies or worse, using our own professionals, not outside agencies. 3, double curve our reply by saying we welcome an investigation of them. And finally, 4, start feeding lurid blood, sex, crime, actual evidence on the attackers to the press. He later says, find or manufacture enough threat. And this was because of the Australian, you know, Victoria, Australia investigation into Scientology, which all came about. I mean, Steve Kinnane's wonderful book, Fair Game, History of Scientology in Australia, shows that the whole thing, Scientology ending up being banned in 3 of the states of Australia for a while there, it all came about because one guy asked for his money back and Hubbard wouldn't give it to him. And he happened to be connected to the Australian Labor Party. And along came this case, which, you know, and Hubbard gets very, okay, we don't mind an investigation of us. Let's have an investigation of you. Stop feeding lurid blood, sex, you know, just this squalid attitude towards humanity. Not really what I think of as a good religion, I must say.
So because the length and breadth of Scientology criminality is so vast and wide, I emphatically want to call this part 1 of 3 parts, because I have so, you know, not only do Scientology do criminal acts on their own public, they had a technique of finding some elderly person, and as long as they had clean credit, giving them a ticket to fly in to Los Angeles, offering them free hotel, free airfare. And then when they came here, the Regis would make them take out 10 credit cards, 10 credit cards.
Being the salespeople, registrars.
Right. The salespeople, 10 credit cards, ask for 7,000, so 70,000. And even though computers work so fast, Chase would not know that Wells Fargo gave 7,000. Wells Fargo wouldn't know Bank of America simultaneously gave. So 70,000 credit, boom, the cult would take all 70,000. And this old man had no way even of minimum payments to keep up 70,000 a month in payments. Now the cult had not even a blink of an eye thinking, we're harming this old man of 70 years old, 75 years old, whatever, not even a clue. And then it all exploded. And I'll have dear Spike put the link called the Chase Crime Wave when it all flushed out at repeated Scientology conduct to steal money, elder abuse of old aged pensioners, almost, you know, people living on welfare and social. As long as they had good credit, Scientology would gouge. This is just a sample of the kind of criminality. In the case of Paulette Cooper, all she was doing was trying to write a book. She was an author. She was going to write a book on it. Yeah, she's going to write a book on it. And it's hilarious how it's absolutely hilarious. There was a guy who had done some courses in the cult, and he visited with her and said that he was Jesus Christ in a previous incarnation, and that Jesus was going to rape. She's a beautiful woman. That he'd heard voices, whatever, that Jesus was to rape her, but he was Jesus. And she just thought, there's a story here. She was a writer. Yeah. Somehow Scientology convinced the guy that he was. So she started investigating, looking into it. And oh my God, I'd like to do, Tony Ortega wrote the book on it.
The Unbreakable Miss Lovely.
The Unbreakable. Let's put a picture up there of it. He wrote the book on it. But
and we at Toronto at the Getting Clear of Scientology, the Getting Clear of Scientology conference, which I really think people ought to have a look at. It's very inexpensive. But we had Paulette and Tony there, and I sat on stage with them, and we were able to have some conversations about what had happened to her. Paulette's a good friend of mine. Tony is a good friend of mine.
Yes.
And Paulette, just some of the things that happened, I think the most heartbreaking was finding out that somebody who she'd considered a close friend for a couple of years, when the FBI raided, the biggest raid in their history, they showed her, she was just about to be indicted by a grand jury for a fake bomb threat. They'd managed to get her fingerprints on a bit of paper, and she determined that she would kill herself if she was indicted. She'd been harassed down to almost nothing. She was she was about 90 pounds in weight when they're finished, having been, a very tiny thing by then. And she was shown the reports that this friend of hers had written. Got Paulette up on the roof of the building today, couldn't get her close enough to push her over the edge. She's talking about suicide. I'm encouraging her. So this, what they call covert hostility 1.1, is exactly the behavior that this man was going through. And they'll, when the head of investigation in this country collapsed in my office, having come to get me, and told me, she'd got 4 agents actually inserted into my life and another one in training. And so I was surrounded by these people. This idea, rather than straight dealing, straight talking, and being truthful and honest, these are not aspects of Scientology. It's devious, it's Machiavellian. Yes. And it's vicious. And the idea that, when I moved away from East Grinstead, it's a folly. I lived there for nearly 11 years after leaving Scientology. And when I moved away, the harassment fell by at least half, because I hadn't realized that any Scientologist who's put into a so-called condition of liability, they have to do something to harm the enemies of Scientology, and that would be me. And so every week there was somebody knocking on my door. You know, my house was broken into. Leaflets were distributed. Well, not leaflets, a little booklet accusing me of all sorts of horrors was distributed to all of the houses in East Grinstead. We caught one of the guys who was doing it, and the poor lad ran away when we got him. But you know, reports to the police, reports to the fire department, reports to the tax people, anything and everything to mess your life up and make you walk away. And it's despicable. It's time that somebody did something about this. An American president stopped accusing the Germans of being anti-religious for restricting membership of their civil servants, and saying you can't be a Scientologist and work for the German government, because, as has been demonstrated in court cases in Canada and France and in the US, you work for Scientology. So if there's anything there, like the police lieutenant who was stealing FBI reports during the lead up to the Guardian's office case, and they would, you know, the Vanity Fair journalist who for 20 years was ringing up any journalist who was talking about Scientology and finding out what they'd got and reporting it. Paulette Cooper was one of his friends. Antonio Ortega exposed him ultimately. But, you know, keeping private detectives following Pat Broker for 24 years at a cost of $11 million, tax-free because it's a religion. This is this is not right.
There will be a day of reckoning. There will be a day of reckoning, you know, but the PR is in a free fall. It's beyond any possibility of repair. Every day there's a new horror story. Just to wrap up, a couple of highlights on Paulette Cooper. They had put her name and address in porn groups and magazines, and they wrote her private home phone number in Manhattan toilets.
Yep.
As if she was a call girl, a prostitute. This is the kind of, she was an author writing a book. And this is what they did. They also had someone live in with her, a Guardian office operative, Don Alverso, who would take her up to the 30s. She lived on the 32nd floor, make her overlook.
That's what I was talking about, Don Alverso.
Huh?
He knew him as Joe somebody or other, all Guardians.
Right, but he was found out he was Don Alverso. I've got a picture of him. It was actually my private detective friend, Gary Hoffman, who it was just brilliant the way he was uncovered. And anyway, a couple of people phoned him. He wouldn't answer the phone and he wouldn't respond to any phone calls. He lives back east and working with his brothers in some automotive thing.
I named him in 1990. So that must have disappeared from the record, but I traced him down. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Wow. Yeah. Merrill Lanier needed so much to know who he was from Merrill's book.
Yeah.
And that's how. Anyway, so I do want to continue. We've done an hour, but I want to just continue to expose deep and horrible criminality with their vicious streak. John, I just want to acknowledge and tell you, you were a little bit ahead of your time. By ahead, I mean, you were like a lone, now there are so many hundreds of enemies they've made. They turn around, there's another lawsuit, they just have too many now.
The late Arnie Lerma, when I asked him to write a puff piece for Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, and if you haven't read it, please read it, everybody. It's still the only history of Scientology that's come forward. There are a lot of wonderful ex-member accounts, but I set about making a history. But when I asked Arnie for a puff piece, he said, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was Jon Atack. And there were a few of us, Lawrence Wollersheim, Bob Penny, Jerry Armstrong. There were a few people, but I was a bit different because I suppose Bob Penny was as well. Lawrence, his life had been destroyed. His family, his business, his health, his mental health had been destroyed. And so he wanted recompense for that quite properly. And they, of course, said not one thin dime for Wallersheim, and didn't tell their members when they paid him $9.2 million, which they did actually do, most of which went to the lawyers, of course. Jerry, they just wouldn't leave him alone. He just wanted to go home and not have to think about any of this. And they tried to kill him, tried to run him off the road. It's in the Breckenridge decision, a judicial decision. With me, it was just, I had no axe to grind. I wasn't upset about my experience in Scientology. I wasn't in the Sea Org. I was never a live-in member. I was never humiliated or abused. I was shouted at twice in 9 years, and I shouted back, and that was that. I was offended, I think, seriously, that I had 9 years of not knowing what this organization really was. Finding out that I'd given energy to it. I'd recruited people, all of whom long since left. But that I felt I ought to do something in response, and then it lasted for 16 years. A few weeks would have done it, but it became fascinating. Why was the history of this group not known? Why had nobody connected these? And it was because nobody who'd been a member and understood the language. It's like with the FBI when they got all those files. There was stuff in there about a group called Branch 4 that nobody ever speaks about. And the FBI had no idea what it was. They couldn't understand the incredible, deplorable, loaded language of Scientology. So when they learned, they got these documents that said the B4 did R245, they didn't know that meant shooting people until dead. And so, there were aspects of the jargon that outfoxed them. I think that there's a tremendous amount of criminality probably from the very beginning. I think that L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs Hubbard's claims that his father had him flying planes to bring cocaine into the US in the 1950s for the mafia and with the mafia may well be true. So there's much work to be done. The main thing is to get the lazy ass FBI to go and do something about it, to clean this up.
What is so intense? See, the mafia know that they're the mob, and that they order wax, and they know that the FBI know who they are and what they are. What is so maddening about Scientology? It masquerades as a church, a religion, but it acts like mobsters. It orders psychological wax on people. It smears them. It's hate, and they consider us haters. They have mirror on the wall. Who's the hater of them all? Scientology is the hater. Everything they do against a critic or an exposer is vicious hatred. But they use the word vicious on me. Whereas I'm giving facts and truth. So are you, John. You've been doing it for years.
My concern is to help people. I'm not an anti-Scientologist, I'm a pro-Scientologist. They need to be helped out of the trap they're in. And they share with many right-wing groups. And let's face it, in Science of Survival, L. Ron Hubbard makes it very clear that he does not believe in democracy. He's one of these benevolent dictatorship people, considering himself to be the best of all benevolent dictators, no doubt. He's an authoritarian. That's all there is to it. It's very interesting to find that many contemporary neo-Nazi groups in the United States, about 95% of terrorism in the US is performed by right-wing groups, neo-Nazi groups, that they've set themselves up as religions too. So the National Alliance, I interviewed the wonderful Calvin Pierce, whose father was the founder of the National Alliance, which took over from the American Nazi Party. He founded the Church of the Cosmo Creator. And they've got all sorts of, they worship Viking gods, or they belong to the identity Christian movement, which is utterly racist and deplorable. But they have sort of, it's almost that Scientology has now this whole idea of, well, we just call ourselves a religion, and then how can we possibly be doing harm? We're a religion. We're good people. No, not really.
Beautifully spoken, John. Well spoken, well summarized. I look forward to part 2. I've got some serious bullet points.
Right.
One of their allegations suddenly came out of the blue 5 years ago is that I'm a prostitute. They thought, oh, if we say she's a prostitute, they don't deny anything I say. They won't take up any allegation I make. They're not talking about anything I disclose.
No response, just the
oh, she's a prostitute. She's a prostitute. They used to say that I was a Russian agent, and nobody believed that. Come on, the KGB hired me. Come on, they had their whole website. They've gone from child trafficker. She's a child. You see, if they attach a label, somehow your credence will be lessened. So I'm going to have fun, and please stay with us. Next episode, I will show you they were even tweeting for Johns to come and visit me, asking how much I charge. They did this on Twitter. I got the account nuked, but it's so hilarious, and it makes for good YouTube stuff. I think I'm going to open a TikTok account and have fun with some of these. John, John, it's always lovely to spend an hour with you. Are you promise me we can do part 2 and 3 of this? We've got a lot.
Many parts as you like, Karen.
Thank you, John. Thank you. John, my dearest John, big hug to you. Take care. It was a lot of fun. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.